Hi everybody, welcome back. Thank you for being here for this panel on algorithmic culture and recommender systems in screen and entertainment media. While much of the scholarly attention and social concern around how platforms use automation to suggest content to users has focused on uneven or biased access to news and factual information, which is obviously consequential for society. In parallel, some scholars and critics have become interested in the implications of what they call algorithmic culture for both our creative and cultural industries and for culture in the more general sense. That is, they're interested in the role of automation in evaluating, ranking, and filtering the shared symbolic ways and resources that we have to represent and understand ourselves and each other. So today, we're here to think about some of the most important recent developments in and debates around the automated curation and recommendation of screen media and entertainment content, which are essential elements of that shared or common culture across movies and TV, games, and social media entertainment. We want to think through whether and in what ways these developments might be transforming our shared culture and how, like earlier moments of media change, they might in turn impact on how we think about cultural policy, whether within our public service media organisations or at the national level. So to help us with those really interesting questions, I'm joined by a fantastic lineup of speakers. I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a minute as they get going with their contributions. They come from a wide range of disciplinary and practitioner perspectives. Each of them works in or on particular fields of media, entertainment, and or popular culture. Each of them has expertise in particular platforms and how the audiences, users, and creators of those platforms interact with the content and search or recommendation systems they provide. And they're here to tell us more about what they already know about those things, as well as to think about what we all need to know much more about and how we might find out. So I promised them that I would go in seated order, but I didn't say which end I was going to start at. So the smart people sat in the middle. I think I'm going to start with our guests from industry down the other end there. So take it away, please, Joel.
Thank you, Jean, and it's fantastic to be here on this great panel. My name's Joel Brydon, I'm the head of digital product at the ABC, and I thought I might start with a few stats just around our content. So on any given day, there's about 5,000 hours of iView content, and we publish around 700 to 1,000 pieces of digital content a day. So our challenge is trying to connect the breadth of our audiences with that diversity of content, and to try and do that from a manual perspective, not going to happen. So we do lean into aspects around recommendations and automated recommendations, and to give you a bit of a flavour of how effective that actually is for us, in iView we have our recommended for you rail. A rail is just a slide of content, and that's our best performing rail. It is algorithmically sourced, and it's about a 22% click-through rate. Our next best is our popular now, which is about 11%. So you can really see the difference there. But for us as the ABC, and sort of just to take a bit of a step back about how it fits into the bigger picture, it's when I was growing up, I turned the TV on and there was 5 options to choose from. But in this day and age, you turn on the smart TV and there's about 100. And some of those players out there have pretty significant deep pockets, as we probably both know. And to compete with them is a real challenge. It's really difficult. And they do the data thing well, they do the personalisation thing really well. And we need to keep parity with that. And that's one of the reasons I'm at the ABC, is because it's been such a figurative icon in my life. To try and protect that for the generations to come ahead of us is a really important mission for me. And to do that, you take the very basic use case of an audience coming to us with intent to watch some content. If they can't find something to watch quickly enough, they're going to go somewhere else. They're going to go to Netflix, they're going to go to YouTube, they're going to go somewhere else. And so where recommendations really comes to the fore is surfacing that content in a much more efficient manner. And Along our journey, it's been a journey around personalisation recommendations. We did a big strategic initiative. We called it Login to Watch. It had mixed response, mainly positive, but this was about mandatory accounts for iViews, so you had to create an account. And we did that. It really, if you extrapolate it back, it is about that remaining on parity with the rest of our competitors are doing. But I would say we learned a lot from that process. We consulted a lot with the Privacy Office of Australia, our audiences, industry experts. And I would say, we actually, our first attempt into there, we hadn't got it right. So we actually stopped, we listened, and we acted. And we did a lot more work. We did about 6 months worth of work that related to things like consent. So we are, as I understand it, we are the only media organisation in Australia that has consent around use of data for third-party or off-platform marketing, be that logged-in audiences or anonymous. We ensure you can turn off personalised recommendations in iView if you want. And we also allow the live streams still to be accessed without having an account. So that's aspects around control. Around transparency was the other big theme that we worked on. And we spent a lot of time thinking about our audience comms and our framing and how we were talking about it. We have released our privacy impact assessment. It's a fantastic bedtime read. It's about 50 pages. It goes into all the ins and outs of how we use the algorithms and how we use the technology and what we're doing, and that's a public document. And next week, we're actually going to release our editorial policy on recommendations, and so that will also be a public-facing document that anyone can go and have a look at and read off. So yeah, look, it's really important for us around recommendations because we can't manually do that, but we're always trying to strike the balance between the use of personal data, making sure we keep our audiences interested at the heart of what we do, but also being efficient at the same time. So that's me.
On to me.
Yeah, I should have mentioned, sorry, the format is we're going to have 2 rounds of responses from the panelists, and I have given them 2 prompts. Let me just give the first prompt to the audience as well so they know what you're responding to. So the first of these prompts was just to introduce yourself, what your role is, what your gig is, and talk about the efforts in your space, in your industry, in your discipline to develop, investigate, or advance the role of recommender systems in the specific screen or entertainment media that you work on, and I suppose in what ways have these systems come to matter? So where are the interesting, chewy or controversial bits and pieces of that as well? So apologies.
I think this is fantastic that you're going to publish your curation guidelines. I might steal that idea. I am Matthew Hancock. I am the General Manager of SBS On Demand. Only on demand. There's about 18 different digital products at SBS. I look after one of them, but it is a big one. I'm notoriously bad for going off script, saying things that get me into trouble, so we'll save that for the questions. I am actually going to work from a prepared document, so I don't get in trouble. So I watched the keynote earlier and I realised that I'm supremely underqualified to actually talk about some of these issues. So I'm going to come at it from a an SBS strategic level, because I think that's where I can add the most value, because really the motivation that we've got on one level is quite basic, which is to get more people to watch more stuff more often. It sounds a bit mercenary, but that is actually the business that we are in. I am smart enough to know, however, that requesting, storing and leveraging data comes with great responsibilities. Many directions we can take it in. I'm not an expert in the algorithmic side of how we might want to pursue this, but I certainly know enough to be dangerous. So we'll see if we get into that when we get to the questions. But like I said, I'll stick on the strategy, where we are, where we want to go. Right, so I oversee a team of 45 people, and they're all subject matter experts delivering on our audience charter and commercial objectives specifically for on-demand. Like I said, not working across other digital products, just on-demand. Cross-functional team's job is to maximise the audience opportunity from the content provided to us across the network. As simple as that. We cover a matrix of responsibilities. That's customer service, it's product management, design, engineering, delivery, curation, digital marketing, and analytics. We let the audience guide the SBS On Demand experience. We use human-centred design principles and other jargon like that, and daily customer feedback if you want to stare into the void and really understand what people hate about what you're doing. We then build responsive product solutions that meet those needs, try to meet those needs, ensuring that SBS On Demand is stable, accessible, secure, supporting scale with a feature set that encourages exploration and allows for dynamic curation and retention activities. We're getting there, we're getting to recommendations. By blending recommendation and personalisation, our curation both showcases the depth and breadth of the diverse and evolving catalogue, and I think that's an important part that we just need to pause on. We want to showcase the depth and breadth of the diverse and evolving catalogue, as well as providing tools for users to cut the clutter and adapt to their playback preferences. We then target retention by leveraging content highlights in owned channels on platform, as well as earned and paid channels off platform, including third-party integrations that I think we'll probably touch on later, and reinforcing digital pathways back to on-demand. Let's talk about recommendations. Right. Please don't think it's infantile, the way that I talk about it, but this is where we can start and then we can dig in deeper. So, On Demand launched in 2011, catch-up service. 2014, we added 1,000 movies. They were exclusive, AVOD movies. We sort of became an early adopter in trying to create a destination over and above just a catch-up service. By 2016, we accelerated spend into AVOD drama, and pretty much since then, we've enjoyed double-digit growth when it comes to both consumption and audience. We've had mandatory logins since 2017. There are now over 10 million registered users. Unfortunately, they do not come back every day. Alongside our linear TV simulcast, we have 11,000 hours of content available any day, any time. Over 2/3 of this is culturally and linguistically diverse. And when it comes to drama, which is kind of like the crux of On Demand, which is quite distinct from the linear channels, 50% of that or more is in languages other than English. We're on 14 different platforms, 60 different device categories, with large screens accounting for 2/3 of our consumption. We have around 15% audience BVOD share, audience share, which punches above its weight when we compare ourselves to the linear offering that SBS provides, not that it's a competition. Personalisation currently exists in the form of continue watching, favouriting and push notifications for favourited content. And we previously had automated recommendations on platform, but 2 significant back-end changes saw us remove them about 2 years ago. So currently, no automated recommendations on SBS On Demand. We will be reinstating them in the coming year, once we have an argument about the best tool and process that we want to deploy to deliver those recommendations. Because a place like SBS likes to buy things at an enterprise level, and sometimes an enterprise solution isn't quite fit for purpose when it comes to the bespoke needs of streaming. That's not on the script, and now I know that it's being recorded. Hope no one from SBS watches that. Right, so one of the changes, we had to change our data management platform, and the other one was that we've now integrated, we've rebuilt an API with our catalogue, so it integrates with Grace Notes, so we get richer metadata at a content level. We needed to update the architecture, and we've got to learn how to walk before we can run, so that's why we paused with the recommendations. The automated recommendations we had were very basic. It was what's trending, for you, more like this. For you and more like this were based on rudimentary metadata tagging, not shared attributes of users. The reality is, when we bring it back, we want to go deeper, we want to go harder. And when I think back to the what's trending, it was really just mirroring whatever the weighting was of other recommendations that we were putting on site. So, to be blunt, we have a large amount of unknown content, thousands of hours of international programming, which many of our audience have not heard of, and that in itself should lend itself to recommendation. But one of the reasons, and that's probably, I suppose, one of the reasons why I'm excited by the opportunity for automated recommendations to make stronger connections across the 11,000 hours, because some of the connections are lost in the biases of the 2 curators that we have currently hand cranking the collections on platform. But as you'd expect, it's never easy. When you overlay the business objectives, the vision, the values, the purpose of SBS, it all becomes harder. So let me be mercenary. If we're looking to drive reputational and commercial return on investment for originals and high-cost acquisitions, then there's a need to push them hard as well, to actively seek an audience both on and off platform. So to what extent can we rely on automated recommendations alone to do that dirty work for us, I think is one of the questions. 3 things, I'm wrapping up now. When it comes back, we're going to start with algorithms as a kind of operational efficiency. First things first. Using algorithms behind the scenes to help our curators spin up thematic collections quicker without their inherent individual biases, essentially using these collections from a template to then hand crank and mix with our priority content. So it's a bit of a blended approach. Then we're going to provide personalised on-platform recommendations by a small selection of shelves. I can't remember how many you said, but we're probably thinking maybe 5 out of the 40 that we currently have on our website. So not huge, and we're not going to change the game entirely. But we will do entire automation when it comes to things like recommended end-card, low-hanging fruit around, more like this suggestions, things like that. I think they're baby steps. It just comes down to how many the parameters that we as a business want to apply on top of the personalisation and the recommendation that we're going to deliver to people. I think I'll pause.
Thank you. Donal, over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jean. Hi, everyone. I'm Donal Hetici, a research fellow at the ADM+S Center and RMIT School of Computing Technologies. Very glad to be here among these panelists. Today, I'm going to talk a bit about our research work that looks into multi-party recommendation, and we use Spotify as a use case to conduct this work. Before I jump into the research work, I want to come at recommendation from a computational perspective and dissect it into simpler terms. Traditionally, when we look at recommender systems in computing, we recognize 2 entities. So we have users, and then we have items. So items could be things like books, movies, or news items that we want to recommend to the user. And then users come into a platform, and they try to interact with these items. And then the platforms will try to use different input from these users. So for example, you would use the explicit ratings that the user would provide. So this could be you going into Netflix and pressing the thumbs up button to indicate that you particularly like a specific movie. But then you could also provide implicit signals. For example, you might start playing a particular movie, but then you might stop it halfway through. That indicates that you're not that interested in that movie. Whereas if you watch a movie from the beginning to the end in a single run, that indicates that you really like that particular movie. So the current platforms, they have an inherent benefit because they're seeing a lot of data that provides a large range of implicit signals in addition to the explicit signals. So historically, if you look at a platform like Goodreads, where you would go in and rate books, you only provide this explicit signal. They don't have any implicit signal to look at. But if you go to a platform like Netflix or Spotify, they have all the data that they need to create more informed and more rich recommendations to keep the user engaged in their platform for a longer period of time, perhaps for their benefit to do advertising and to do all those activities. Now, this lack of data in an offline setting or a research setting also creates challenges. So for example, if we want to create a new type of recommender system, or if we want to create improvements to existing recommender systems and then test it on data that comes from a platform like Spotify, we don't have access to all those implicit signals. We can perhaps rely on some explicit signal. We might ask a user to rate 10 items and then use that data to kind of make an informed recommendation, but that's not as effective as doing some A/B testing that you would do from an organizational perspective, things that Spotify can do on their own. So to come around this challenge, we are actually using sort of a novel, but also an interesting experimental setup where we would ask users to sign in with their Spotify credentials and then we are able to kind of look into their listening history, and we are able to extract the recommendation generated by Spotify, and then we can make adjustments to those recommendations based on the properties and based on the characteristics that we want to achieve in a research setting. And then we can get the explicit signals from the user, and then make informed judgments about how they feel about these recommendations, and whether they like the particular recommendations that they receive in the platform. Now, I didn't tell you why we wanted to do this. So we wanted to do this because current recommender systems are always user-centric, so they want to optimize the content to keep the user engaged in the platform throughout. But there's this growing need for recommender systems to cater to different stakeholders who are involved in these platforms. So if you think about Spotify, not only the users, but you also have content generators or artists who are actually creating content for the platform. You might have podcast hosts who might create podcasts for the platform. And then you might also have record labels and other interested parties, which might be regulators who would want to impose some interesting sanctions or interesting policies into the platform. So taking all of these into account, we are experimenting, and we are looking at whether we can create recommendations that are considerate of all of these parties, such that we are not only optimizing the output for the user, but we are also providing benefit for the other stakeholders, which can improve the sustainability in the recommend ecosystem. Our team is also working on different domains, but I think for today, I'll talk about Spotify alone. Right. That's for me. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you. Robbie.
Thanks, Donal. Thanks, Jean. Hi, I'm Robyce. I'm at Monash, and I'm currently doing a project on the video game distribution platform Steam. So Steam is kind of, there's a lot of different ways that we can compare it to other services. I think it's very easy to think of it as sort of like the Netflix for video gaming. It's also very similar to things like Google Play and the Apple App Store. Steam is kind of a unique and quite odd beast within video game distribution. It's one of the oldest digital distribution services we have. Its earliest incarnations are from 2002, which is actually before even the App Store was up and running. It's also a service that caters to a purely desktop-based community, so it doesn't do any of the mobile gaming or any of that sort of console gaming type environments that we see sort of happening out there. Steam is a sort of fully integrated platform in the kind of classic way that Tarleton Gillespie talks about it, and folk like Mark Andreessen. It's not a platform that directly, like they don't own the games that they sell to you in most cases. What they do instead is use a commission-based model to take money from game sales through the platform. What this means is that Steam isn't actually really that invested in pushing any one person to consume any one particular piece of product. They're not really interested in pushing people towards sort of high-value products in the same way that Netflix might want to do with some of their particularly expensive titles. Instead, what they want to do is just sort of keep that gear of consumption running, keep people engaged in gaming, keep people engaged in purchasing, because the commission serves them best that way. In terms of the experience of actually using Steam, it's a desktop application. It pops up, whenever you want to play a game that you bought through it, it'll pop up as a sort of dashboard that you can navigate. You get pushed through into a store page where you'll get all sorts of sales or adverts or any kind of new games that are up and coming. Games can be very sort of expensive or very cheap. It varies quite a lot. But in terms of it, one way to think about the complexity of the market is actually, I scraped the whole platform, so I hope no one from Steam is actually listening, but I scraped the whole platform, and you can look at the rate of game production that is happening at some point. Like, at some stages, we're seeing like 60 to 70 games released per week. So, if you're thinking about that, you've spent 2 years developing your game, you put it out on Steam, and you're up there with 9 other people, and then tomorrow there'll be another 10, and so on. So the real emphasis on the recommendation system and getting attention doesn't come from Steam itself, but rather from these publishers and game developers who are really trying to sort of work out, how do we create a title that will cut through the noise and then sort of compete with each other to get that attention. mention. So what you see is actually a lot of sort of tagging, user-based sort of curation, but also you see so much work happening off the platform to curate how the recommendation services are going to work when people actually get on there. So we see a lot of things like sort of the cultivation of attitudes around taste, around preferences. We see the development of canons around what games are popular. You can also see the fact that there are so many different business models for making money through games, not just through a direct sale, but subscriptions, through token sales, through loot boxes, all sorts of other things. There are so many different factors that we need to take into account when we're trying to understand what's going on here. Maybe rather than give you like a long, extended discussion of games, because I can just do that for hours, I might just pass it off to my friends and wait for questions.
Fantastic, thank you. Kylie.
Hi everyone, my name's Kylie Papalato. I am a legal scholar and a DECRA fellow at the Queensland University of Technology. And in general, I study digital disruption in the creative industries. My DECRA project focuses particularly on the massive changes to screen production and distribution that we've seen with the rise of subscription video on demand services like Netflix. And I'm concerned about, well, I'm looking at what is getting created and distributed, how diverse is it from a matter of representation, is it meeting both the needs of what audiences want to see and what the Australian cultural policy we have around national identity and what we want to be distributed. So whose stories are being told, whose voices are being heard, and is our cultural heritage being preserved? These all sound like purely cultural studies questions, but actually they're also legal questions because they're a matter of copyright policy. Copyright law controls all of this basically, how existing works are licensed, how they're made available. Copyright law is the reason why we don't have access to a great deal of older or archival or niche material, often because they're tied up in various contracts or licensing agreements, sometimes, quite commonly, because they are what we call orphan works. And for those who are not familiar with the term, copyright law lasts for a very long time. In general, the life of the creator plus an additional 70 years after that person dies. And if you're thinking about TV or film productions, there's a great deal of creators involved in that, and a lot of contracts, a lot of different rights management. Sometimes the small production company that produced that TV show or film goes bankrupt, or somewhere along the line we lose track of who owns what and where the legal rights lie. And under copyright law, if you don't have permission, you can't use it even if you don't know who to get permission from and you can't find that person. So we have a lot of works that just sort of linger and they can't be used because we can't get permission, even though they might be really important to our cultural heritage. So my project looks a lot at these kind of things and how we can get access to this content, how we can make it available. But what comes after access is visibility, and legal and technical availability only goes so far if audiences don't know what content is available and how they can find it. And that's where recommender systems come in, and as our industry friends have told us, there can be thousands and thousands of TV shows and films in these catalogues, and many of them may not rise up to the surface of what is being recommended. So I'm looking at how those recommender systems work in that space, what is being recommended, how diverse are those recommendations, particularly in terms of, again, whose stories are being represented, and what are the policy levers we can use when we think that more of a particular type of content ought to be visible or recommended, but that doesn't quite align with the business interests of the subscription platform. So yeah, and I'll hand on to Ari.
Thanks, Kylie.
Thanks, Kylie. So I'm Ariana Matamoros Fernandez. I'm a media scholar at the Queensland University of Technology. And I'm interested in similar questions, like Kylie was saying, what kind of recommendations YouTube does. So I study recommendations within the context of YouTube. That's what I've been looking at. And sometimes when we think about YouTube's recommender system, we think about what's the up next feature, right? So we are watching a video and we are being recommended like another video to watch. But actually, YouTube recommends videos in different ways. It's not only the up next feature, but it recommends videos when we search for information. We have a search query. It recommends videos when we open YouTube and it's in the home page. It recommends videos when we click to the videos that are trending, that these are not personalized. It's what YouTube considers that these videos are trending. So when I started doing work on YouTube, there were some studies that were saying that YouTube was the great radicalizer, that were a lot of rabbit holes of information and radicalization and harm. And a lot of the studies that were being made were through network analysis. So they were static moments in time where scholars were kind of going down the recommendation chain, but for a particular query, a particular moment. And I did a collaboration with Bernard Reeder that was also at the University of Amsterdam, that was also interested in the socio-technical aspects of YouTube and how we could understand better the recommendation systems. And actually, what he was suggesting at that time, that it was very important to, instead of trying to understand how these systems work, because it's really difficult, these systems are opaque. We know some things. We know that they want to show you videos that are fresh, recently uploaded. We know that they take into consideration personalization. So we know certain things, but not all of it. And then what he was suggesting is that a way to move closer to how algorithms and these recommender systems work is to observe what they do over time. So we started with how YouTube was searching information as a way to understanding how it was presenting search results around different sociocultural issues over time. And we could already see how it was changing the way that YouTube was ranking information, and was ranking information in terms of relevance, depending on the issue that was being queried. And I think that this is really important, because when we study these recommender systems, sometimes we just looked at, okay, we know that there's a business model there, that they want to get the user's attention, but we forget a bit the user aspect of it. And in platforms like YouTube, what user cultures do in these systems, it's really important to understand how these recommender systems perform. Because we have users that are really invested, for instance, with gaming, and they use YouTube to socialize, they publish a lot of content, and this is picked up by how YouTube recommends systems. So when you understand what these algorithms do over time across different sociocultural issues, and you do this qualitative analysis, you start understanding the central role of the user. And I think that this has important implications that probably afterwards we will discuss in terms of policy. So how to really think about how to improve these recommender systems that Donal was talking about before improving how what these systems do. We need to understand what they do. Sorry, so before intervening. So that's the type of work that I've been doing, always contextualizing recommender systems within the complex socio-technical systems that social media platforms are, that really respond to different markets, to the user, to advertisers. And I think that's it for now.
Fantastic. So a very simple prompt, just tell us what you do and what recommender systems have to do with that, has surfaced, I think, a really interesting map of the kind of multi-stakeholder, multi-motivating aspects of these systems. And already there's a bit of convergence you might be surprised to find. So we're going to move to our second prompt now, and Ari, just to warn you, we're going to go the reverse direction this time.
Okay.
So with all of that in mind as a baseline, and speaking from your own expertise and interests, the second question's about this broader question of, in Scary Bunnies, algorithmic culture. What do we think about this concept? You feel free to push back against it, to interrogate it, deconstruct it, whatever. Do we think this is a useful concept? If so, for what? Does it overstate the power of, leaving aside the technical definition of algorithm, perhaps does it overstate the power of recommender systems or search engines and so on, and stop us thinking about other really important elements of our cultural and media systems, like copyright, for example, as Kylie was mentioning. And then for those of us interested in sort of whether it's organisational strategy or national cultural policy or whatever it might be, or training future creators, how do we think about the question of, I suppose, cultural value or the common good questions around cultural value in this context of sort of hyper-personalised targeted recommendations? And of course, we might also want to question the overemphasis on personalisation and its role as well. So the panel's all been prepared to tackle any bit of that, so they aren't feeling at all overwhelmed by that long stream of sentences and ideas. Ready to go? We'll start down this end with Ari.
Yeah. All right. So first, the question around algorithmic cultures. I think for me, because it has culture there, it works as a term. Especially like in my own work, I think that when we looked at these recommendations or search over time, and you do the qualitative analysis, you see, okay, what kind of channels and why are they being recommended? You look at the subscribers, you look at what they are talking about. Again, the user cultures are really important. So algorithmic culture, I think it's productive, and it moves us away from the YouTube algorithm in singular. It's a lot of algorithms. It's deep learning. It's sensitive what happens outside YouTube, because we live in a hybrid media system, so we can't really understand how the recommenders systems work in isolation. So as a term, I like it. And then I thought that to answer this question about algorithmic cultures and how the user cultures influence these systems, 1 week ago I went to Canberra into a digital methods winter school, and I was collecting some data for the students to analyze, visualizing how YouTube is ranking information around Roe v. Wade. But I thought, okay, I will look at, for a week, I will collect every day the top 10 results that YouTube is ranking for Roe v. Wade, but I will also collect the same information for abortion. And then we looked at the different results with the students using the YouTube data tools that Bernard Reader developed. That these are tools that normally work as if it was a user based in the US with no previous history. So personalization is not really accounted for, but nonetheless you can start observing how YouTube thinks about relevance. And then what was interesting when we looked at this with the students is that for Roe v. Wade, most of the relevant results were from US news media channels. And we've seen this with the work that we've done together, Jean, with COVID-19. We looked at the recommendations that YouTube was giving for COVID-19 as a query, and most of the channels recommended were news channels. So it kind of suggests that there's a sort of intervention with controversial newsy topics, and Roe v. Wade at the time was, and actually, yeah, the top rank sources were news channels. But when we looked at abortion, there was a channel that was ranking really high, and it was an influencer, white family, pro-choice. Sorry. anti-choice, so like anti-abortion. And it was ranking really high all the time. And if you look a bit into how YouTube is used by these influencers that are against abortion, you start understanding how they are networked, how they are well-funded, how they are posting information about abortion on YouTube constantly. So it was interesting to see how this channel was not visible for the Roe v. Wade, but at the time that this was happening, if you look for abortion to have information about abortion, this channel appeared and it was ranked. So a long answer to say that I think that it's a productive term, the algorithmic cultures. And briefly, I think that you asked about policy, or at least this is what I had in my notes, that how we might, the reality of algorithmic culture, impact on policy questions. Like 2 quick notes. I think that it's really important when we think about policy, and Luisa Bartolo, that is a great scholar also working at QUT, is looking at this. It's not the same to look at how we might think about recommender systems if they recommend books, that if they recommend videos, that if they recommend news. We have to have like different type of interventions, because what is being recommended, it's very important. And probably we will need different normative frameworks to really make sense or just guide good recommendation. And in relation to this, also the platform specificity, it's really important, precisely because the user culture. So if you go to Twitch, you will have like different key actors and users that are also really influencing and working to really game these systems and had them being recommended by the platform. So we never have to forget about these platform specificities when we are talking about recommendation and policy interventions.
Thank you.
There was so much in the prompt that Jean said, and I'm actually going to keep my response pretty short and just focus on 2 kind of bigger questions or provocations I've been thinking about recently. Neither are specific to law, although I'm happy to talk more about copyright or content quotas or any of that if people have questions afterwards. But one of the things I've been finding interesting is that I think we're at a really interesting point in time when automation is increasing, but we're also getting better, I think, in general in society about thinking more deeply and with more complexity and nuance about how we represent and relate to different cultures. So if I'm thinking about TV, for example, you don't have to go that far back to find examples of where representation in TV meant having a token brown-skinned person in the TV show, right? And it was one person, and normally they didn't have a huge role, or they were there for comic relief or something like that. And these days, I think we're a lot more engaged with questions of how different cultures and different types of people are being represented, and what are their stories, and are they represented in a way that shows the variance in their character and their personality. But how does that nuance translate to automation and recommender systems? Because diversity and representation are really complex social questions which are really hard to operationalize. So is it possible, Donal might be able to respond to this, but is it even possible for recommender systems to optimize for that sort of deeper understanding of diversity? And so far, I think it's been pretty poor, right? NAIDOC Week wasn't that long ago, and quite a lot of the platforms had recommendations based on NAIDOC Week. And I think just from looking at them, it's pretty clear that they're either manually curated, and so quite exceptional and probably only lasting that week or maybe a week beyond, or they're automated but in a pretty blunt and unsophisticated way. So how can we get better at that in particular? And related to that, the second thing is, how comfortable are we with tweaking algorithms and automation for normative purposes, for good. So giving people recommendations that perhaps don't align with what they necessarily think they want to see, that aren't entirely based on the user, but are based on policy goals. And that's quite a controversial thing, but I think it's coming up in many areas of recommendation, not just with TV, but with books, for example. So Ari mentioned Louisa Bartolo, who is our PhD student, and she's looking at recommendations on Amazon books. And the fact that, when you're searching for feminist history topics, a lot of what you get recommended are anti-feminist texts. And to what extent do we think that those ought to be tweaked in certain ways to deliver certain social good outcomes? So that's the other interesting question, I think, for recommender systems.
In terms of this question of algorithmic culture coming from Ted Striphas particularly, at least with regards to game studies or the study of games generally, the term comes from Alexander Galloway's, I think, 2006 book on gaming, where he talks about games as algorithmic cultural objects. And so, at least provisionally in terms of the history of my discipline, I have to sort of accept that games are a part of algorithmic culture. In terms of more specific questions around STEAM and thinking about like what algorithmic culture means in that context, I think we kind of have to, at least for a second, recognize that there's a lot of research into the cultures around gaming generally that note how toxic, anti-trans, misogynistic, racist attitudes are sort of, they're fairly prevalent in games. It's not the whole community, but there's a very loud voice that is probably pretty obvious to many people who pay any attention to what's happening in the games community. That group, and I would say probably people who play games generally, are quite interesting in terms of algorithmic culture because I think unlike the way that Frank Pasquale was talking earlier about the sort of individual relationship to algorithms being sort of one of privacy problems, transparency, concealment, and explanation, and so on Steam, the algorithm is sort of known and acknowledged by all parties, and these sort of toxic or not so toxic groups have a actually pretty strong class consciousness, and I mean this in a sort of like non-Marxist Weberian sense, that they recognize themselves as a group of people that have a shared interest around a particular kind of content coming to the fore. So the algorithms, such as they exist on Steam, are subject to a lot of influence. Anyone that's been watching the way that large studios in film have been paying attention to social media, you might be familiar with the Robyce sort of tweet storms. You might be familiar with the Snyder cut sort of influences through social media. These were attempts by parties unknown to influence studio decisions. But that sort of stuff, in film it's exceptional, but in games it happens all the time. To the extent that at the bottom of the ads for individual games on Steam, you can actually see sort of ticker tape trackers of how the games have been rated over time. The community sees itself as not only having a voice, but having a demand to actually influence the algorithms directly, because they see that not necessarily as something that influences recommendations, but sort of more as a metric of popularity or interest. And so it becomes this device that gets used to beat studios over the head, often via publishers, where these groups will identify a problem. One memorable example that I can think of is a minor character being disclosed as trans, and it's such a minor sort of reference that you would otherwise miss it. But this led to a major sort of influx of people voting down the game, making it extremely unpopular and becoming this sort of reference point for abuse and hostility for quite some period of time. Gaming is absolutely algorithmic culture. People in the games community recognize these algorithms as something that they have a say in, which is distinct from how we were thinking about earlier. There's a class consciousness there that I think even though the toxicity is like super terrible, there are lessons that we can learn about collective action around algorithms that I think is worth paying attention to.
Yeah, I think I'm really fascinated about these kind of conversations, and then why we really need to look into this aspect of recommender systems, and in particular like automated decision-making systems. But I'm going to briefly touch on like 4 factors that would somewhat help us think more about how we can address some of the problems or some of the issues that might encounter when we talk about this topic. So the first thing I would like to note is modern recommender systems or modern platforms that make recommendations to users use a wide range of components. So it's not necessarily a recommendation that the platform is making, but it also includes search components. So for example, if you think about YouTube, you might input a specific query, and then you might try to find a video that matches to that particular query, which is a relevant matching task, different to a recommendation task, where in a recommendation task, the platform would try to look at your past interactions and past input and try to give you a new item that you would like to consume at that point. So I think it's important for us to have a deep understanding about these different components, because these different components also have their inherent limitations. And then it is helpful if researchers from different disciplines can work together to identify these limitations and work together to kind of get rid of those things in future work. The second thing that I wanted to highlight is platform governance, like how can we impose policies in organizations or companies that actually implement these recommender systems so that it's beneficial largely for the end users and the consumers who are in these ecosystems. One simple example is the controversy surrounding the Joe Rogan podcast in Spotify. You might all recall. These podcasts contain misinformation, but then Spotify initially was reluctant of getting them out of the platform. They defended their exclusive content producer, which I think is expected. But then due to the public backlash and other actions from other content creators, they ended up removing a large number of episodes from their platform. Now, this also leads to subsequent actions taken by Spotify. They recently established Spotify Safety Advisory Council, which is an independent body that looks into how recommendations are made in a platform like Spotify. So I think these kind of directions are important in imposing external values and societal values into private organizations that are making recommendations, which I don't think that is a necessary step, but I think that's a good step forward in these ecosystems. The 2 other things that I wanted to mention are actually research directions that computer science researchers pursue in terms of recommender systems. So one is getting rid of popularity bias and increasing the diversity in recommendations, as Kylie mentioned earlier, which I think is really important. The popularity bias is an identified limitation in recommender systems. This is due to the way that we generate recommendations from a technical perspective. If you don't have enough input signals from particular users, you can't really make an informed, diverse recommendation to that particular user. But there's a large amount of interesting research happening in this area, and I think there would be interesting findings that could lead to better, diverse recommendations for users. The other factor is explainability. So can we let users know how we arrived at a particular recommendation so that they can make an informed judgment about whether to consume that content or not? Some of my colleagues in the center, they're doing very interesting research on explainability. I would encourage you to kind of talk to Casper, Flora, and Edward, who is doing some interesting work in this area. So those are the things that I think would really benefit interdisciplinary research in making recommendation systems more beneficial for users and for the society at large. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Fascinating stuff. I've got to ask the question, is it the recommendation that's the problem with a piece of contentious content, or is it the fact that the piece of contentious content is on the platform in the first instance. So I'll just let that hang. I'm going to go back and tackle your proposition around, whether it's yours or not, the proposition around algorithmic recommendations may have perhaps changed the cultural environment. So thinking selfishly here, just about screen media, I can't help but feel that the move away from linear time constraints was what actually transformed the cultural environment. I think in a the broadest sense, the ranking and evaluation functions of old media and new media, if they're still the terms that we're allowed to use, are not hugely different. This is what I mean by that. You make a show to target an audience opportunity. It costs you a lot of money. You put it in prime time to harvest as many eyeballs as possible. You throw a mix of paid, owned and earned marketing behind it. It might succeed. Unfortunately, many of them won't. It probably won't. That is still the case, but if we leave broadcast out of the equation, on a streaming service you still have to make or buy expensive shows. They don't always find the audience. You need to develop ways for these shows to cut through, to be pushed to the front of the queue, to mitigate the risk of failure. That is the business strategy. Now, business is not operating independently of the audience need. So I am actually left asking, how much can SBS, in the context of our vision, values and purpose, rely on automated recommendations as the driving force of content discovery, as opposed to it being a kind of an augmentation to the hand-cranked curation? I'm interested to get... I was going to steal some of your ideas if I talked after you. But, I'll have to wait now. But it'll be interesting to see how similar or different we are. Yeah. Perhaps this means I'm on the side of algorithmic culture just recasting old issues. That may be unfair. Perhaps it's about sharpening our response to the old issues. I'm going to try to frame it as active and passive curation. So this is definitely going to be a stretch. This is me pretending for a second to be an academic. All right, let's go.
We're in the right place.
Yep, I'm trying. On linear TV, you can watch only one thing, one channel at a time. The audience is being served a piece of content that the programmer believes they want to watch. It's an active step by the broadcaster to feed the audience a specific morsel. I'm telling you shit you already know, sorry, but that's proposition one. On the flip side, on-demand service, which is at its core a smorgasbord of many morsels. How am I going with this? Yeah? Smorgasbord of many morsels. You can search, you can browse, it's a lottery about what you may watch at any point in time. Hand-crank recommendations are passive. We showcase things that we think you may want to watch or aid exploration of our rich catalogue. That's a lot of what we're trying to do. We're trying to surface things that you may have never heard of so you can sample them because you have limited marketing budget, limited ways of finding audience for content. But unlike broadcast, no one is saying that you have to specifically watch that show or leave. Now, automated recommendations equally don't force the user to watch a specific piece of content, but I am going to argue, that in some use cases, when working to their full potential, and I think that's probably the next level of the conversation, when working to their full potential, they should be more active. They should be active. They should tap you on the shoulder, remove the clutter, create a path of least resistance, to narrow and at the extreme present you with the single most compelling piece of content that you need at that moment to stay on platform. That is the ambition. Anything less than that ambition is a waste of my time.
Amen.
Yeah, you like that? Sweet. We're going to get on fire. I thought it was going to be SBS versus ABC, but not now. We haven't even talked about the ugly reality that SBS has to, target people with advertising and all of those things. Might get to that in the questions. So I think there's always going to be... Oh, sorry, I should say that connection feels a little tenuous, but hopefully there is a valid point in there somewhere. And I have completely glossed over where we were getting to with some of this conversation around what the complexities of the recipe are. You definitely need to tweak the recipe. If you're not tweaking the recipe, then you're in trouble, I think. I think there'll always be a blend of platforms that are based on varying degrees of automated recommendations. There'll be platforms that are 100% recommendation. There'll be some that are like ours that will never be 100% recommendation. Automated recommendation. algorithmic recommendation. The question is, I think, will we know it as an audience member? What will we know? And that's what you guys have been talking about in terms of that transparency. To be honest with you, this is not me talking as SBS, this is me talking as an audience member. I'm not sure I care. I think there's certain environments where I will care about the transparency, the efficacy of what's being presented. Do I care about what Netflix is recommending me? No, if I don't like it, I'm not going to watch their shit service. Simplistic. I told you I was going to be simplistic at the start of this, right? Where was I? I've gone off script. I was not meant to go off script. Yes, there's always going to be a blend. And perhaps how much we can control it in roles like mine if we look to deeper integrations with third parties. Oh, I've gone in half sentence. Gone halfway through my sentence. There's a point in here about third-party integrations that I want to get to. So hold that thought. Integrations. Yeah. I'm just going to dive in and talk about third-party integrations at the moment. We used to be able to rely on this idea that we were going to build an app. Someone was going to download it. It's not on Samsung TVs. We're not in a revenue share arrangement with them, so you're going to have to go and download it. It's not easy to find. And then you're going to have to remember to keep on going back to that app. And I want you to keep on going back to that app, not just because we're a public broadcaster that's got a reach, reputation, a purpose. We want to have engagement to, I suppose, justify our existence and make sure we deliver on our charter. I also need you to watch the ads because that's actually a really important thing for SBS to be able to augment our government funding. We only get 2/3 of our money from government. Our ability to generate advertising revenue is entirely what has funded the development and growth of on-demand over the last few years. But we don't have that luxury anymore of just hoping that people are going to find our app. We need to be where the audience is, and increasingly in the wild west of connected TVs, that means integration into third-party user interfaces. That means doing content feed work so our content is searchable. Increasingly what? By voice. Voice search, aggregated into a Tizen Samsung TV, or continue watching shelf being built into the, or not us building the shelf, but us enabling the Samsung Tizen shelf to be able to display what they've been watching on demand. That doesn't just happen, that's not scraping, that's us doing work. You'll probably be better at talking about the work that's required because other people in my team do that work. It's very confusing, but it's very important because we now need to sort of walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to build a great app, killer app, best app. Got to be better than ABC iView, otherwise we're in trouble. In trouble? We'll get a show of hands in a second. Anyway, I've gone off script. I'm now over time. I am going to say, can't remember future content for that matter. Yeah, so why don't I just answer that question around kind of the policy settings, or at least my simplistic view on where I think some of the policy settings should sit in a media environment. I think content quotas are important, and so are public service objectives when you're working in a place like SBS or ABC. But I would say a lot of this conversation starts with access. You're going to be able to access the content. You're then going to be able to be aware of the content. And from there, things like catalogue mix and discovery comes into play. So there's a few massive hurdles that we need to get over first. It's our job to make sure that serving audiences with evolving and compelling local stories, or in my case, multilingual international stories, is not reductive to the point of people taking medicine. I worked at Screen Australia, the Australian Film Commission, Screen Producers Association. I've worked in lots of environments where public policy and in particular local content quotas have been discussed, but I do find often it becomes reductive about taking medicine. I think if we meet the audience expectations and needs head on, then to some degree, again, being simplistic, I do hope the recommendations kind of take care of themselves a little bit.
Lucky last, Joel.
Sorry?
Lucky last.
Fantastic themes. I'm just sort of mellowing in all what's come up, and I'll try and weave some of it in some of my thinking here. But I suppose I just wanted to share a bit how we think around the personalisation, the recommendation side of things, and I suppose concepts around filter bubbles. They're really a non-event as I sort of talk through some of the approach that we do. And coming back to the theme there around diversity of content, we actually strategically try and drive diversity of content, and it's actually in our best interest to, and I'll come back to that one. But a couple of points. I think the first, we will never be totally algorithmically controlled by our surfacing and content. From an internal perspective, we all understand that manual curation is the focus. People come to the ABC because of the content that's manually created from news, education, kids, entertainment. And you can actually see that play out. So when I talked about the recommended for you rail, that's the fourth rail down in our view. It's not the first. You actually have to go below the fold. And so all of that beforehand is actually manual curation, even though we know the click-through rate for that rail is more effective than the manual side of things. Similarly, if you go to the ABC homepage, we've got a rail there called Daily Discoveries. That is our most effective. It's driven by the algorithm recommendations. That's the third rail down on that page. So again, we're prioritising the human aspect that relates to surfacing the content. I think also we, like the SBS, we adhere to a very strict editorial policy. If you've ever seen the Senate estimates, we're very much held to that. And so all of that content, regardless, is by virtue of our charter, we need to be balanced. So I suppose this argument that we're trying to drive a certain agenda or certain perspective one way or the other, by virtue of the content that we're putting out there, it all has to adhere to that very strict policy and be impartial and accurate. And then thirdly, we know if we're able to actually suggest that second bit of content that's outside of what you're consuming, that actually leads to stickiness. And that also goes the same as around our products within our ecosystem. If you come in for iView and we can start to recommend you the news app or kids or listen, of which have a lot of varying content in there, that actually the engagement on that for those audiences is much greater. So we don't want to keep you in this small bubble. We actually want to surface the broad range of what we are, and that's actually unique. I think we're sort of both unique in that sense that we're not just a Netflix, we're not just a Spotify, we're not just a YouTube, we're not just news, we're all of those things together. And so for us to sort of survive in that space, we really need to sweat that as a point of differentiation. And that's what does come out in how we think about the algorithms and how we think about the recommendations. I really like this term from Spotify. I have to reference them, algotorial. I don't know if anyone else has heard of it, but that really speaks to how we think about it internally at the ABC. So that combination of the algorithm with editorial. And those two things being combined, like it's never one or the other, and increasingly more of both. And I think, as I mentioned, it'll always be the manual side of things will take priority for us. And that, when think about even fine-tuning the algorithm, that is done in a way, or fine-tuning some of those recommendation rails, that is done in a way where we're sitting side by side next to the content, our content folks. And when I say we, it's the people building the recommendations, and we manually test it. We sort of push things out there and go, is this right? Does this feel okay? And there's that quality assurance that happens even before something goes public. So yeah, we think about all of these aspects. I really think that diversity of content's a really interesting one. I think it's I suppose another question on that is like, when we start wanting to drive that diversity, how do we actually measure that? And that's something that we have a bit of a challenge doing, because there's a subjectiveness around that, that term diversity. But we do want to be able to promote, the breadth of what we are, because it's actually an asset of being many different things.
Thanks. Wow. Just occurs to me that the term diversity could have been quite a good one for our keywords session yesterday, because it does mean such different things in different disciplines. Thank you for a fantastic conversation. We've got time now for some Q&A with the audience in the room and on Zoom. I've got the Zoom here. Nothing there yet, so... Oh, yeah, go for it. Yep.
So, my question is for Matthew. So, you spoke a little bit about eliminating bias through automation. right at the start. And I think that a lot of people in the space would challenge the idea that algorithms are somehow neutral or unbiased. So I guess my question coming from that is, what would like a non-biased recommender system look like to you from your perspective? And also I'm curious about the kind of strategies or plans that you have in place to develop something that's like non-biased.
Okay, why don't I start by clarifying what I mean by the inherent bias of the two people that are doing the curation. You have 11,000 hours of content on platform, and I would challenge the concept that those two people have the ability to make all of the connections and the possible connections between that content to be able to surface it. There's limited real estate, and so what I have found with our team is that we often surface the same content all over the time. And that's not necessarily being surfaced to drive a, to drive a return on investment opportunity. It's not about necessarily raising it because it's a high profile piece of content that we want to get more eyeballs over. It's because they've only got so much capacity in their day to look outside a certain bundle of content. What I hope we can achieve out of something like I suppose a less bias, a non-bias, to use my own language, although I'm not sure that I said non-bias, but let's run with it, algorithm would be to draw on the rich metadata that we are now getting, which is over 100 metadata traits via Grace Note, that allows us to make connections that those two people may have otherwise not thought of. Not trying to manipulate people, just trying to give people more options to consume based on the rich, diverse catalogue that's there. And I think filtering it through just two people is a limit. So I think that's where I was getting to with that. But like I said, you might get 5 to 10% of the shelves, which are the same as Rails, on demand, being algorithmically driven in the future. So there's still plenty of time for those two people to deploy their bias.
Dan Angus.
Thanks. Sorry, I feel like I've hogged this thing all day. I can't help myself though. So yeah, Dan Angus, QT. A theme that I've noticed is the length of time of this content. So like Ari at your end with YouTube, we're talking maybe 5, 15 minutes or so, right? With Donal, with Spotify, we're talking songs and 3, 5 minutes maybe, or a whole album. With iView, SPS content, movie length, whole program. How much is this factoring into how we consider recommender systems in this environment? Because I imagine there's very stark differences, and from the ABC's perspective, when you've got a charter about fairness and bias and balance, that you can contain that within, say, a single hour of content quite well, and you perhaps have to consider it at the algorithm level because it's kind of taken care of at the packaged unit level. So I guess thinking about this issue of the temporal, like the kind of size of the package and unit of content.
I'm gonna start by then throwing it to you because I'm fascinated unless anyone else wants to go first. This is a real issue for us. People view episodes, we want to recommend series. We don't recommend other episodes, so you don't end up with episode 12 of series 3 of Insight. You get recommended Insight. So and so out of the box recommended solutions like something like an Adobe Target really struggles to deal with this concept, which is you're buying a brand of sneakers, show me more sneakers like that, but actually what we want to do is show you more brands. So you watch an episode of Alone, Series 2, Episode 3, we actually want to recommend you Alone at the highest level. So then you've got 9 series of Alone sitting in there, or whatever the case. Insight, 20 years of Insight sitting there. So the tile that you see being recommended is at the highest possible level, even though your consumption is at the bottom. So at what point do you then stop recommending people that title? What is complete? 1 episode? 2 episodes? 50%? How do you do that?
Well, I was going to say, I don't think we weight time of content highly in terms of how we recommend. And yeah, I'm just thinking through it because right now, audience members will come into iView, and we're actually strategically trying to think about more short form in there, especially around news. And so we don't want to be sort of skewing based upon you watching, series of drama and not then suggesting you something short form and thinking about that, again, back to the diversity of content. So it's not something that we weight highly, especially when we start to think about the broadness of our ecosystem, where we just have varying degrees of length of content through audio, written, and what's not. So yeah, I don't think it's something that we weight highly in our space.
And when I've looked at what YouTube is recommending, you can extract the length of the video, but we didn't look at this category to just make sense about how YouTube was recommending. But if you look at the literature that has interviewed content creators on YouTube, and then this ethnography work with content creators, some content creators in this algorithmic gossip and folklore about how algorithms work, they think that the length of their videos will influence the way that they are going to be recommended. So it's definitely something that as a content creator you think about, and definitely something that also you think about as a content creator for monetization. So if you want 2 ads in your video, so then you will just really be really strategic about doing the length of this video to monetize on the platform. But I didn't look at it for the qualitative analysis.
One more down there, and I have one on the chat, I think.
Great, thank you. My name's James. I'm from an organisation called Digital Rights Watch, and we're one of the people who were quite critical about ABC's move to mandatory login. I'm curious because we're talking a lot about the size of these video libraries, and there's this assumption that more and more choice and bigger libraries, which seems to be an assumption that is good, and we want more of that, which is what is ultimately necessitating the need for these algorithmic recommendations because of just the limited bandwidth that people have to consume this content. But these obviously come with problems, which the panel has identified, and these algorithms are not good at identifying a number of things. They don't necessarily lead to better policy outcomes or better societal outcomes. And I'm curious if there are especially this is probably, I feel like the public broadcaster boys at the end have had plenty of time to talk, but it's probably also at them as well. But have we thought about other solutions to these problems that may not be about just increasing the amount of content that is on these platforms, and maybe we should have smaller libraries or other ways of dealing with this problem that don't rely on surveillance and algorithmic decision making?
Anyone like to?
I have two thoughts in relation to that. Both are a little peripheral to your question, so I do apologize for that. But in terms of the size of libraries, in what I'm looking at in terms of access to content, I feel like there's 2 competing things with that, right? One is in screen content, what is quite unique to screen content at the moment is that it is spread across many, many different services. Reducing libraries would most likely increase the number of services, and that to me becomes a consumer equity issue, right? Because there's already too many for most people to afford to subscribe to, whereas in other content like music or books or games, you can subscribe to one platform and get access to most of the things. So I think that's one concern. On the flip side, and where I think I agree with you a little bit, relates to some of the responses I've seen around content quotas, which is, so as background, right, the free-to-air networks have content quotas where they have to have a certain amount of Australian content, a certain amount of dramatic content, etc. which is regulated through their licenses for the airwaves, basically. That same regulation doesn't apply to subscription services because they're delivered over the internet. So to make sure they have certain levels of content in terms of Australian content, Indigenous content, etc., requires new regulation, and legislators have been grappling with this. One way that some countries have responded, particularly in Europe, for example Germany, is to say, we're not imposing a quota, but we're going to pass regulation that requires a certain percentage of the profits that Netflix, for example, makes from subscriptions in Germany, from German citizens, to be invested back into local production in Germany. That is good, but it privileges always new production, new production, new production. So to me, it's an incomplete response because we already have a lot of good content. I'm not saying don't produce new stuff, but we also need to think about what happens to that long tail and how we can ensure that that remains accessible and we're not always focused on producing the new. So, yeah, that's my response.
You want
I'm happy to answer, but I don't know if you want to go first.
I appreciate the question, and I suppose the perspective on it in that we're not really after more content per se, but what we are after is to be able to create a platform that is engaging, and that when people come to our platform, they can find something to watch. And so obviously there is a relationship there between something to watch and volume of content. And we are, strategically, we are thinking about more about that second view of second use of content based on us being traditionally a broadcast company, organisation, and thinking about how we can take that content and that second time use of that content and basically on demand and transferring to that. So, look, I think the reality is that we are going to be creating more digital content, but for me, it comes back to those points around control and transparency. And I think if you're creating the platforms and where the audiences are coming and having a clear understanding about how data is being used, what aspects of control that they have around any aspects of personal data, and ensuring that is all very front and center, very obvious, transparent, I think these elements can live in harmony. My concern as someone with a vested interest wanting the ABC to continue to be relevant for the next 90 years, my concern is that if we do not compete with some of those other players out there, and that there is a relationship there to volume of content, the ABC, the SBS, we start to pale in insignificance, and that to me is a much more dire state of affairs than the other.
We might leave that one there because I've been hassling the people on Zoom to ask a question.
I'm happy to chat to you afterwards, though, if you want.
And so I need to ask the question. I'm going to, this is from Kunal Chand, who's a PhD student at QT. I'm going to editorialise a little bit. Sorry, Kunal. You're probably used to it. So Kunal's got a question about the thorny issue of companies pleading that the algorithm is a trade secret and that being a major barrier to transparency. Already Ari's talked about how perhaps observability of the output is more valuable from a public oversight perspective than understanding, like getting access to the algorithm. I guess I'm curious about, I think that's a well-known issue with the commercial environment. I'm kind of curious about this, taking under advisement what you've just said about being super careful about not being exposed to, let's say, less friendly interests, using that oversight for ill, let's say. But are there perhaps more opportunities for public transparency beyond individuals knowing what we're doing with their data, but for, I don't know, let's say collaborations with researchers to understand how to measure some of these issues around diversity of content exposure, for example. I don't know, what do you think the opportunities might be for anyone? Not necessarily
Yeah, I could add like a couple of things there. Yeah, that's actually a real challenge because if you think from the company's perspective, you can't just publish the algorithm because then you're out of competition. So I think there are two things that companies are actively doing which are really useful for researchers and other people who really want to interrogate the algorithm. So one thing is publishing data sets, anonymized data sets coming from the platform. So Spotify released a very large data set that includes podcasts recently, which is really helpful to drive research in that area, for example. The other thing is the companies could also conduct research and benchmark their in-house approaches against published approaches. And those kind of targeted studies that present A/B testing, for example, can provide a very good picture about how their in-house algorithm compares or benchmarks against what we know. So if the company algorithm is outperforming the state-of-art algorithm to create diversity in recommender systems by 20%, so then we know that the company is actually doing something better than what's published in the literature that's out there. And that can help researchers to kind of gauge where they want to whether they want to advance or whether they want to kind of criticize and interrogate more into these kind of platforms. Yeah.
Not sure I would have any concerns about people accessing algorithms. In some respects, SBS is working with an out-of-the-box solution or trying to work with an out-of-the-box solution which is imperfect to the challenges that we've got. So it's not like we have a team of data scientists sitting there writing a bespoke algorithm where we bought Adobe Target.
I think that's a great perfect
this
example
is the
of what we're
commercial
talking
reality
about.
of it.
But what we might want to understand is how the deployment of that out-of-the-box solution is, what results that's providing for Australia.
That's why I thought that, that your suggestion of publishing some sort of guidelines, I probably would consider it perhaps more about aiding the user journey. As I view it, there's obviously many different types of algorithmic recommendations, but let's use two simple ones which would be the starting point for SBS. One would be, you've watched 5 shows, I've watched 5 shows, 4 of them are the same, 2 of them are different. Just tell me what the other guy's watching, or the other person, or whatever the case might be. Right? That is just a great recommendation, because if you look at an old school television schedule, it is pretty much blocked out by genre.
Yeah.
Thursday nights on SBS for 20 years were food. Right? Very basic. Very basic. We now actually have the ability to be a little bit more targeted to give people what they want. So if we can use a recommendation that can match people's tastes, then we're not bound by saying, oh, you just watched a period drama, so you want to watch another period drama, right? So I consider this to be a great freedom move for us. I don't know, I wouldn't necessarily see it as a manipulation, particularly if we can say to people, hey, here's what other people, but it's got to be better than people who bought this also bought that type thing. It's got to be sharper, and I suppose that gets into the detail. The other one, which goes to the first question I answered, which is around metadata, which is, again, simply, let's come up with a shelf of period dramas, and then I go have 2 people remember all the period dramas that we've got out of our 11,000 hours, which I don't necessarily think is an arms race of content. I think it's more a function of rights changing. I can talk about that later, because it's actually about the rights model changing that's generating those hours. So I think that there's probably not as much, certainly in SBS's perspective, not as much mystery about it. And I wouldn't mind explaining to the audience, when you're looking at this shelf, this is what you're getting, to help guide their decision making, because like I said at the start, all I want is people to watch more content that is relevant to them, that is delivering against our charter.
Yeah. And we would love to know how that's turning out at scale across the population. So
currently failing, that's why we don't have any recommendations on the platform.
I think, unless you have a very quick final word, Kylie?
I do have a very quick final word, which is that I think that is an excellent question that you read from Zoom. I don't have an answer to what you said, Jean, but I do think trade secrets are a massive problem that we're all going to have to grapple with. And it's a particular gripe of mine, because I think that, trade secret protection has been ramped up in the US in recent years. And it's the one area of intellectual property that has no time limit. If you have a trade secret, it's protected for as long as it's a secret, which I think is so counter to competition, but it's also a real impediment to our research. So if there's like one area around advocacy that is probably going to be relevant to us in the ADMS over the next few years, I think trade secrets will be one of them.
Fantastic. Let's end on a challenge. That's what we like. So let's please thank our panel and then go to the Collide Theatre for drinks.